Thank you, Dr. Nhlapo. I mean, I think everybody in this room knows, as educators, one of the key requirements of being effective is to be flexible. So we never say it's a reshuffle or rearrangement. We say we're just being flexible teachers and educators. Second thing, I know a lot of you probably were waiting to listen to the minister first and then perhaps leave. And as a policy person, I think I'll claim this as a carefully crafted strategy to keep you on for just that much longer in the day. Okay, I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you, Dr. Nhlapo. What I really want to do, and what I was going to do later, but I think it's appropriate coming now, I want to talk about the context of our research program that we're undertaking, and to locate the research on teacher education we're doing in some of the global and continental issues. So let me start by also offering my welcome and my pleasure at seeing so many of you here, and so many friends, colleagues, and people I've known for a long time. I think for us it represents an important occasion as a center and as a chair, as it reflects the continuation and strengthening of our focus on teachers, teaching, and teacher education. I guess there is no more important priority than that. And I'm going to quote a speech of the Deputy State President in 2014, and I'm going to add a bit to that quote. Citing a report, he says that the McKinsey reports, and I'm starting the quote, underline our contention that transforming our education system requires a sustained focus on the quality of our teachers and principals. And that teachers are not the problem. Teachers are the solution to many of our problems. And in a sense, it's a theme, I think, that we confront in our research. But I want to add to that quote, because I don't think it's just about teachers. It's actually fundamentally about teaching. It's about what happens in the classroom. And this is a powerful statement, and it's a powerful statement, and it echoes what the majority in the whole already know. But I think it's important to talk about what more than 12 million learners in South Africa know. That for 9 or 12 years, depending how long they stay on, and the attrition rate is very high, given who starts school and who ends up in grade 12, they will face a teacher. And they will experience both good and not so good teaching. And I think it's important to recognize that 12 million learners or more will spend as much, if not more time, with a teacher and in a school than with their parents or guardians. Lottie, who wrote about, and it's a very old book, but I think it's significant, he says that the average student spends about 13 hours in direct contact with classroom teachers by the time he graduates from high school. This is talking about the US context. I did some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations, so it's not precise. But this would translate in South Africa to about 16,200 hours of teaching time over 9 years, and 18,000 over a 10-year period, or close to 20,000 hours if the NDP plans are implemented. Now, as an aside, and I know analogies are often unfair, but I think if you spend that amount of time with a medical doctor and you came away dissatisfied, you'd feel immensely unhappy. And I think that is why, for us, what happens to learners and what knowledge, competencies, and dispositions they acquire through teachings and teachers and their teaching is an important question. And there are several reasons why this is an important issue. Because on average, teachers are, in terms of salaries from education budget, represents the single biggest component. South African data varies province by province, but about 80% of expenditure is on teacher salary. It can be lower in some provinces. And I don't think that's a reason to talk about reducing teacher salaries. That's a reason for talking about how you maximize the return on the investment. What kind of support do teachers need? What kind of systems must be in place for enhanced teaching effectiveness and performance? But I think we must also recognize that salaries as the highest component of expenditure does have a result on crowding out expenditure on other items. The second factor why I think our research is important is that perhaps, and I would argue this, that teachers and teaching is the single most important instrument, and I'm using that in a very loose way, to affect equity in teachers. There's some different evidence about that. Some evidence says that in the classroom of the most effective teachers, students from disadvantaged backgrounds learn at the same rate as those from advantaged backgrounds. It's debatable, but it does make the point that teachers can make a difference. Some studies in the USA about mathematics teaching found that teacher effects are higher in low socioeconomic status schools than in high SES schools, and that in low SES schools it matters more that teachers are effective than in high SES schools. Another way of putting it, that if you want quality and if you're interested in equity, it's getting effective teachers in schools that need them most, rather than schools that need them less or not or very little at that point. And we know from the growing body of research, it's not much, but there is growing, that teachers have a significant impact on student learning. Several meta-analyses and some single-country quantitative and qualitative studies of successful student outcomes from a range of contexts have attempted to identify the impact of teacher quality on student outcomes and the factors that make a difference. I'll go to the UK. A recent article in the UK found that pupils taught by teachers that demonstrated characteristics associated with teacher quality, in inverted commas, achieved nearly half a grade higher than those taught by those teachers who lacked such characteristics or struggled to teach effectively. A meta-analysis of research from 1990 to 2010 on school-level factors influencing student outcomes in developing countries concluded that more knowledgeable teachers and other factors like absenteeism or presence, homework, are among some of those few but as important school variable which shows a positive relationship to student outcomes. So in a sense, similarly, a study of maths showed that teaching experience, teaching qualifications do make a difference in outcomes. Now again, these are very suggestive studies. Some are more rigorous than others. But I think for me the important takeaway message is that teachers, their characteristics and their performance in the classroom makes a difference to what learners learn. Now, in a sense, one could say that all what such research does, it makes the common sense fairly obvious. It's what we all know anyway. But I think it's good to have some data behind it. But the concern with teachers is not specifically a South African concern. I think it's indicative and important that the AU's second decade for education, which concludes in 2015, lists teacher development as one of its core priorities. The goal states that AU is working towards ensuring the provision of sufficient number of teachers to meet the demands of education systems and to ensure that all teachers are properly qualified and possess the relevant knowledge, skills, and attitudes to teach effectively. The goal goes further to say, teachers should also be properly supported and adequately remunerated to ensure high levels of motivations. It notes that the chronic shortage of competent teachers and qualified teachers in Africa is exacerbated by inadequate and training facilities. But it says the issue of teacher shortages need to be seen in broader terms. This has to deal with issues of how stable the job is, how attractive it is to get teachers into teaching, and it has to do with the opportunities for career progression. In other words, the AU decade, the second decade for education, is making the point that effective teacher and teacher education and effective teaching is as much about professional development as it's about the governance and structural issues that regulate teachers' work from progression possibilities. And in an international development context, we standing at the edge of the post-2015 education and development dialogue that is drawing to a close, almost. It will be at a close in September this year when the UN General Assembly meets. And already the Sustainable Development Goals is seen to be as the overarching framework of development. And the report is very clear that it talks about ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. I think it's significant in several important respects, but the one most obvious one is that this goal, which will finally be agreed, is unlike the previous goals where the emphasis is not on physical access. The emphasis is on quality and learning. Like all goals, it needs to be further specified, further defined. But what is significant in the further specification of this goal is that there's a strong emphasis on qualified teachers able to perform effectively, adequately supported during that initial preparation program and post the initial teacher preparation programs. So clearly, if you view the phenomenon of the research we are doing from a national, continental, and international context, teachers, teaching, and teacher education is the heart of the future agenda, whether it's going to be for the next 15 years in the form of the global post-2015 education agenda, whether it's in the National Development Plan, or whether it's in the DBE action plan. All the documents are referencing teachers, teaching, and teacher education, because clearly that's what's important. So what we do as a center and the research we do, and I guess this conference is addressing, is at the heart of these debates. And for us in this context, it's not just about this research. It's also about creating a cadre of researchers in the field and developing a robust research program which will enable informed policy dialogue and debate. And in South Africa, this imperative of teachers, teacher education, and teaching is important because if you want to realize the goals of an education system that prioritizes human rights and social and economic development, in context of deep-seated historic and structural inequality, as well as in context of all forms of diversity, teacher education is a priority. And we argue as a center that despite the policy attention on teachers, and globally or nationally, it doesn't receive yet the sufficient research attention that it merits or warrants. To this end, the research program that we're embarking on, we aim to provide critical evidence-based research on teachers, teaching, and teacher education that can support policy work in the field and perhaps contribute to policy implementation. We're not naive to believe that what we do simply translates into simple policy prescriptions and statements, but certainly what we're trying to do is create an evidence base to have informed dialogue. And if I had to summarize what we're doing in a sentence, I think what I would set out is a series of questions that we're trying to answer. Who are our teachers? Where do they come from? What education or support or initial preparation do they receive? Where do they end up on graduation? What support do they receive on graduation as they enter schools? And what impact do they have on the lives of the learners they are teaching? These are indeed, for me, difficult and challenging questions, which perhaps gives me less sleep than I require, but they're important in realizing the policy commitment to quality education. And crucially, it's not quality education per se. It's about quality education which has at its heart redress and equity through, and in education. We have addressed this through several research projects, which includes we're beginning to work on a longitudinal study of initial teacher preparation in South Africa with several universities. We're going to look at continuing professional development in South Africa and Africa. We're going to look at issues of teacher professionalism and accountability, because we believe that the voices of teachers in debates about where they are and what they expect, what is expected of them is important. And we're going to try to analyze the changing policy landscape of teacher education in South Africa since 1994. But we'll do this very conscious of the word in our title of the Center, International. We want to look at the issues of teacher education in South Africa, both from an understanding and an orientation that is internationalist in orientation, but also from strong collaborative partnerships with the kinds of partnerships hopefully you'll listen to and see today. And that's why, for example, we will be working on several cross-country, cross-comparative research projects, including a 5-country studies of teachers and peace building in Rwanda, South Africa, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Uganda. And all this research, as I said, aims to improve performance and the governance of management, inform government efforts to improve teacher performance and governance and management of teaching, so that the quality of education in South Africa is transformed to the benefit of learners and teachers, with particularly and with priority the poor and the disadvantaged. And in the research we do, while we focus on teachers, teaching, and teacher education, we do not ignore the institutional context and the governance and regulatory frameworks that underpins teachers' works. And in this, we also need to better understand who the teacher educators are that are generating the next generations of teachers and what they do and the conditions they work under. And so this narrative spoken about in the research we do about the importance of teachers and teaching is fundamentally, globally, is about how do you ensure that you have good quality teachers in every classroom and that learners learn. And what about teachers must be engaged with to make them part of the process of reform? Obviously, the starting point must be dialogue and participation. But I want to make 2 conceptual points about teachers' roles in reform. First, I think, as everybody knows, the act of teaching can be quite individualistic and an isolated activity. If you're in the classroom, it's a private world. So we need to consider how the act of teaching is less individualistic, less isolated, and that how teachers are not isolated only in their classrooms, not insulated from collegial feedback, and thereby enhance their capacity to engage in substantial collective change. I think it's important, but we also need to ensure that teaching is more than simply lesson plans, units of studies, and assessment. That's important, and just so that it's clear, it's not unimportant. But I think the one thing that characterizes the activity of teaching is that it's a present activity that focuses on a long-term vision of a future. In a sense, through lesson plans, through the pedagogies you employ in classrooms, what you're doing is setting out the future, and the future of the good society that you want to achieve. To put it differently, in this very day of this colloquium, there is teaching and learning occurring, and we can debate how good or bad it is. In every classroom, that should be focused on future possibilities. And finally, we need to ensure that teachers are supported such that they change and become a force of change. The inertial tendency of doing things as they have been done in the past cannot become a roadblock to deep-seated transformation of historic social and structural inequalities. But we must be mindful that whatever we expect of teachers must be set within a context. Context matters, and the work of teachers and teaching cannot be understood without a consideration of the context within which it occurs. And this is a healthy warning for me about some research which assumes a simplistic, linear view of the relationship between teaching and learning as if it were a straightforward causal connection. Because it can't be straightforward. Because what effective teaching is and the extent to which it can be sustained is impacted by vast poverty, vast linguistic, vast racial, and vast cultural difference. Why I'm mentioning McKinsey is because I want to return to the start where I quoted the McKinsey report, because I think the problem with the McKinsey report is very useful. But what I think is that it shows the activity of teachers from its context and denies it an evaluative component. So Leading from there, I want to make two closing points about context and about the conditions under which teach. The first is that we do and should expect much of our teachers. Clearly, that's why there's solution. But we should not at all assume they are superhuman. We need to tailor our expectation in light of what is reasonable in the challenging conditions. This is not an excuse to justify ineffective or poor teaching. Poor teaching in any context or time or space is unforgivable. It is to remind us that we need to consider from policy, practice, and professional development point of view that what teachers can deliver needs to be set in context, and we shouldn't assume that they are some kind of super beings. It also is a warning about loading on too many expectations of teachers and tailoring expectations. Secondly, I think where the point I want to add is that teaching is about student outcomes, and that's an important. But it is a bit more than that. It is about producing the kind of good society we would like to believe we're working towards. And if that is the goal, then what is needed is a value-driven, defensible approach to teachers, teaching and teacher education, which foregrounds the values of social justice and equity. Thank you.